Shana Tova, everyone. So before I begin, I'd like for us all to play a little game. I hope you'll play along with me. You all know it. It's called Simon Says. So, Simon says, pat your head. Simon says, rub your stomach. Simon says, pat your head and rub your stomach at the same time. Close your eyes. Oh, Simon didn't say. Did I catch you? Be honest. It's Yom Kippur after all. Most of us are familiar with this game. In this game, we're supposed to do whatever it is that Simon tells us to do, but if the magic words Simon says aren't said and you do it anyway, you're out. So here's my question for all of you. Did you just pat your head and rub your stomach because Simon told you to, or because that's what you really wanted to be doing? And if it's because Simon told you to do it, who is Simon and why does he get to tell you what to do? Why does Simon get to make our decisions for us? And why are we blindly following his directions? And we know that the truth is because in this particular case, we want to win the game. And most of us would say that in a real life scenario that of course we would make our own choices and we wouldn't blindly follow whatever Simon tells us to do. But sometimes it's not that simple. How many poor examples of decision making do we see in the Torah? In the book of Genesis alone, we encounter all sorts of very questionable choices. Rebekah helped Jacob to trick Isaac into giving away Esau's birthright and blessing. Lot tricked Jacob into marrying Leah and then forced him to work 7 more years before marrying Rachel. Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery and faked his death. Abraham cast out Hagar and her son Ishmael and then nearly sacrifices his own son Isaac. In just these few examples, we see how easily influenced we are by peer pressure and the forces of jealousy, anger, and fear. No, sometimes making our decisions of our own free will isn't so simple. In the past decade or so, the genre of dystopian literature, TV, and film has captivated people from every corner of the globe. You'll know these as The Hunger Games or The Handmaid's Tale, to name a few. A dystopian society is the adverse outcome of an attempt to create a utopia, a perfect society. Now, dystopias are often characterized by totalitarian regimes that maintain control of citizens through oppressive rules and regulations that they would say make its society more perfect. I would argue that the very first dystopian society comes from Torah. So I just want you to think about this for a second with me. On the 6th day of creation, God created human beings. Adam and Eve were given free reign of this utopian paradise, free to do anything that they chose. All they needed, God provided for them. And they were given only one simple rule. They were allowed to eat of the fruit from the tree of knowledge, or they were not allowed to eat from that one. They were allowed to eat for every other one. Do this one thing, and all that you need will be given to you. Follow this one simple rule, and God will provide everything that you need to be happy and healthy and safe. But human beings were not meant for that kind of life. We're not meant to sit passively, waiting for our needs to be met. We're meant for something greater. And so the fruit of the tree of knowledge proved too tempting for Eve to resist. This seemingly perfect society was in fact imperfect, and I would argue dystopian. Though Adam and Eve had everything they needed to be happy and healthy and carefree, this was not a life worth living. Like the heroes and heroines of today's dystopian tales, Eve was not tricked into eating the fruit. She was making a choice to leave behind a world devoid of purpose and meaning and pursue a life worth living. Seeing Eve in this light, it's easy to recognize that dystopian literature is hardly a new genre. Apart from Torah, it's been part of our own literary repertoire for quite a while. I know many of us will remember reading George Orwell's 1984 in high school. But in the last decade, this genre has catapulted from the depths of our English lit classrooms to the top of the New York Times bestsellers list. But why is it that this genre has become so popular? What is it about these movies and books and TV shows that draws people in? Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale TV adaptation became an instant sensation that feels just a little too realistic for many of us. A radical group known as the Sons of Jacob exploits religious teachings to create a militarized patriarchal society where women are completely stripped of their rights and personal freedoms, including the rights to their own bodies. Borrowing from our very own Torah stories, young women are forced to become handmaids, reminiscent of the stories of Hagar, Bilhah, and Zilpah, birthing children that are taken from them for the families they serve. In 1984, the buck stops with Big Brother. Here, Big Brother, aided by the thought police, is always watching us. Big Brother is the source of all truth, and all citizens live by the three slogans of the ruling party: war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. In the Hunger Games, the capital is at the top of the food chain, keeping the districts under its thumb in penance for uprisings. To remind the districts of the immense power of the capital, it forces each district to send one male and one female tribute to the annual Hunger Games where they fight to the death. The Giver describes a community that adopted the principle of sameness, which, as its name would indicate, eliminates any source of differences among its members. The elders of the community assign each citizen a spouse, a home, children, and a job. In this society, there's no suffering, no hunger, no war, but there's also no color, no music, no racial differences, no love. So again, I pose the question, what is it about these dystopian worlds that we find ourselves drawn to? It can't be that we want to be part of them. And one day, after many weeks of pondering this very question, I found the answer in the movie adaptation The Giver, as Meryl Streep explains clearly and concisely, when people have the freedom to choose, they choose wrong. When people have the freedom to choose, they choose wrong. As I repeated this phrase back to myself, I realized how profound her statement really was. In many instances, there is great comfort in not having to make decisions. Why? Because freedom of choice is scary. In these societies, human beings find themselves in positions that, for all of their limitations, are in some ways freeing. To give up control is to give up responsibility. To be free from the consequences of our decisions takes away the incredible burden that we as human beings shoulder. Certainly, Abraham clung to that idea as he cast Ishmael out of his home and raised his knife in preparation to sacrifice his son Isaac. These weren't his choices, he reasoned. They were God's choices. It was God who told him to listen to Sarah and cast out Hagar and Ishmael. It was God who told him to sacrifice Isaac. What was he to do? This provided him an excuse, a way out, where he could pass off the blame and shirk responsibility for his choices. Because were he to stop and think and truly take responsibility for his decisions, he'd have to admit that in his innate use of his God-given free will, he had chosen wrong. What if we lived in a place where Simon was the actual end-all, be-all in decision-making? What if when Simon said we should lie to a friend, for example, we were able to do so with no consequences, no accompanying sense of guilt or feelings of wrongdoing? Would that be worth giving up decisions like what clothing to wear, where we should live, or who we should marry? During the High Holy Days, we find ourselves at this intersection of truth and consequences. We take a cheshbon hanefesh, an accounting of the soul during these days of awe, where we take stock of our actions over the past year. What do our choices say about us? On Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we recite the Unatana Tokef. And this prayer tells us that on Rosh Hashanah it is written, and on Yom Kippur it is sealed. And it asks these questions: who shall live and who shall die? Who by fire and who by water? Who will be tranquil and who will be troubled? What wouldn't we give to know the answers to these questions? The Talmud tells us that 3 books are opened in heaven on the new year: one for the righteous, one for the wicked, and one for those whose fate is yet undetermined. Now, for many of us, this conjures up an image of God who sits in judgment of us, determining who's going to fall in each category, deciding who's going to be inscribed in the book of life for another year. This is why the High Holy Days are known as the Yamim Noraim, the days of awe, or in some interpretation, the days of terror. They leave us feeling helpless and vulnerable and exposed. The Unetane Tokef forces us to confront our fears in a very real way. We are seemingly at the mercy of this God who sits and hands out these decrees that decide our fate for us. The choice is seemingly taken out of our hands as we are forced to recognize our fleeting existence in this world. And in the face of this fear, being able to place decisions about whether we will perish by hunger or thirst, or whether we will be tranquil or troubled into someone else's lap, seems mighty tempting. But the truth is, these events are simply part of the circle of life. Rabbi Ed Feinstein teaches that the answer to each of these questions is me. Who will live and who will die? I will. Who at their end and who not at their end? Me. Like every human being, when I die, it will be the right time, and it will also be too soon. Fire, water, earthquake, plague. In my lifetime, I've been scorched and drowned, shaken and burdened, wandering and at rest, tranquil and troubled. That has been my life's journey. But the prayer doesn't end here. The final lines of the liturgy read, but teshuvah, repentance, tefillah, prayer, and tzedakah, charity, temper judgment's severe decree. We have no way of knowing what life will bring in the coming year, but we have the freedom to choose, and we can direct our own destinies. Earlier versions of this prayer were recorded saying that repentance, prayer, and charity will nullify judgment's severe decree. Nullify, not temper the decree. But we know that nothing we can say or do will change what it means to be human, to be subject to the human condition of fragility and vulnerability. And so the rabbis amended the liturgy so as not to promise something that they couldn't deliver. What they give us instead are tools that we can use to affect change in our own lives. Teshuvah, we don't have to remain stagnant. We don't have to dwell on the mistakes of the past year. We can do teshuvah and have the chutzpah to ask for forgiveness for any wrongs that we've committed, and the compassion to forgive ourselves and our loved ones for the times when we or they missed the mark. We can't change the past, but the future is ours for the taking. Tefillah, we can lift ourselves up with prayer and connect to the people around us to form a community of love and support. We can reach out to God and to each other to heal the wounds of our past and celebrate our joys together. Tzedakah, we can pursue justice to the best of our abilities. We can give of ourselves, our abilities, our time, our talents, knowing that God fills the spaces between us and connects us to one another as we answer the call, tzedek, tzedek, tirdof, justice, justice, you shall pursue. The Unetane Tokef reminds us that though things happen that are beyond the scope of our control, we do have a voice, and it is we who control our choices. But the choice's hand is not whether to be tranquil or troubled. We know that we will be both tranquil and troubled in the coming year. Rather, our choices are how we act, how we respond, and how we choose to interpret these inevitable stumbling blocks as we walk through life. In his book, The Paradox of Choice, Barry Schwartz explores the question of whether an abundance of choices make us happier human beings. We're faced with hundreds of decisions each and every day. What may have once seemed like a simple request like, go pick up a box of crackers on your way home, has now turned into an overwhelming task as you encounter the 85 different varieties of crackers on your local grocer's shelves. Schwartz explains that freedom and autonomy are critical to our well-being, and choice is critical to freedom and autonomy. Choice has a clear and powerful instrumental value. It enables people to get what they want and what they need from life. And yet he also explains that having an overabundance of choice doesn't necessarily correlate to a higher degree of happiness for us, as we lament the opportunities that we missed and regret the decisions that we've made. How often have we been guilty of bemoaning our decisions, convinced that a different choice, woulda, coulda, shoulda, made us happier people? And we are presented with a paradox. We as human beings have been given free will, which allows us the freedom to choose our own paths and make our own decisions. And yet, having the freedom to choose is daunting. With so many choices before us, how can we possibly choose the right one? How can we know for certain that our choices will lead us to health and happiness and success? The simple answer is that we don't. We don't know anything for certain. And so in many ways, relieving ourselves from this catch-22 by giving the power away to make choices could be hard to pass up. And so we can begin to understand how people could choose to give away their memories and their emotional depth in exchange for happiness and peace in the giver. We can see why some women would willingly cede the ability to own property, to read and write, if doing so meant that they would not have to take responsibility for the ills of society, as we see in The Handmaid's Tale. We begin to comprehend the seductive nature of allowing Big Brother to convince us that 2 + 2 = 5, if doing so would bring us a good life, as we see in 1984. And we can conceive of a world where we would do what the government asked of us, even if that meant sacrificing that which is most precious to us, in exchange for food and shelter and protection, like we see in the Hunger Games. Yes, we can see why these worlds have the power to draw us in. In a few minutes, we'll read from the book of Deuteronomy, which teaches us how to make choices. And God makes it sound so simple. God says, "For this commandment I give you this day, it's not hidden from you, nor is it far off. But the word is very near to you, in your mouth and in your heart, so that you may do it. See, I have set you before you this day life and good, death and evil." God tells us, "Uvacharta b'chaim," choose life that you may live. In that transformative moment of biting into the fruit, Eve chose life. She knew that the right choice was hers for the taking, but it wasn't an easy choice, and she didn't know for certain what the outcome would be. And yet she recognized her world for what it was, a perfect world by many standards, but an imperfect world when it came to the things that mattered. In the Garden of Eden, she didn't have a purpose. There was no work to do, and so she chose life. She chose a life worth living. With all of its imperfections and pain and hardship, she knew that this world was a world of her own choosing. And so in that act of free will, Eve inscribed herself into the book of life. The rabbis tell us that God created human beings and gave us free will, knowing full well that we would make mistakes. We can't always know the outcome of our decisions. We don't know who will live and who will die. We don't decide who will perish by earthquake and who by plague, who by fire or who by water. We can't choose which of these things we will encounter in the coming year. But we do know that through our actions, we have the power to inscribe ourselves into the book of life. And so in the coming year, may we all have Eve's courage to choose life. May we accept the responsibility and the consequences that come from our decisions. May we remember that we may make mistakes, that we also have the power to forgive ourselves and those around us. May we choose to live a life filled with purpose and meaning, all the while recognizing that our choices will yield both joy and sadness. Because if we can do that, we'll be one step closer to once again returning to the Garden of Eden, knowing that the freedom of choice that led us out of the garden in the first place will be the very same freedom of choice that will one day bring us home again. Gemar Chatima Tova.
Rosh Hashanah, Yikazivun, Yom Kippur, Yom Kippur, Yechatimon, Rosh Hashanah, Yikazivun, Yom Kippur, Hashanah yikatevon, ove Yom Kippur yechatemon. Berosh Hashanah yikatevon, ov Yom Kippur, ov Yom Kippur yechatemon. Mi yanuach, o mi yanuach, mi yeshaket, o mi yitorev, mi yishalev, o mi yityosef. Mi ya'ani, o mi ya'asher, mi yushmal, o mi yarun. O teshuv